L'amour est un oiseau rebelle que nul ne peut apprivoiser. Pastor Nat and Mr. Brass are interviewing Bible scholar Joel Edmund Anderson. How are you, sir?
I'm hanging in there.
How was your day?
How was my day? My day was spent at a trampoline park with my 8-year-old son, and then we went to the pool and just typical summer afternoon with little toddler. Not he's not a toddler anymore, but I can't wait for him to go back to school where I can get my life back on a routine.
I'm going to the beach tomorrow, but okay.
No beaches in Alabama where I am.
I'm sorry.
You're in Alabama?
I'm originally I grew up in the Chicagoland area. I lived out on the West Coast for about a little bit in Vancouver, for on and off for about 3.5 years, in the Bay Area for 4 years. Then I was in Arkansas for 4 years, and I've been here in Alabama for the last 12.
What made you want to move here
Well, I mean,
there from Chicago?
well, I mean, yeah.
Chicago,
I mean, haven't you heard that the Republicans are making a theocracy in Alabama?
Yeah. Well, I got to say, I've been here for 12 years. It's really conservative, but I don't think it's not a theocracy. Just people are people no matter where they are, ultimately, in my opinion. But when I grew up in the Chicagoland area, basically I went out to Vancouver to Regent College. Well, after college, I went to the Peace Corps. Then in the mid-90s, I went out to Vancouver, British Columbia to Regent College for my first master's degree. And then I kind of ended up staying on the West Coast for about 8 years. I was 2 years in Vancouver, then went down to San Francisco, the East Bay of San Francisco. I taught at a small Christian school there for 4 years. Then I went back to British Columbia to do another master's degree, this time at Trinity Western. And then from there, I happened to get a job in Arkansas. And then from there, I got another job in Alabama. It's kind of, life works that way. So, oh, are we all muted?
Oh, I'm good. We letting you talk.
Tell the dear audience all about yourself, your blog, and your contribution to society.
Okay. Well, I guess I just gave you a little background on my educational experience. A little bit about myself. Well, where to start? Well, I already told you about some of my master's stuff. I'm almost 50, believe it or not. I've been a teacher my whole life. I taught 16 years at 3 different Christian high schools: California, Arkansas, Alabama. Now an adjunct professor at the University of North Alabama doing religious studies classes, mostly Old Testament, but I've taught a couple of New Testament classes. I also have a blog, Resurrecting Orthodoxy, at myfullname.com, joeledmundanderson.com. And I started that blog back in 2015. And basically, a lot of it has been me critiquing and analyzing a lot of young earth creationist stuff, but then critiquing and analyzing a lot of new atheist stuff. And as well, obviously doing biblical study posts, and it's my personal blog, so whatever I want to do. But mostly it's that kind of stuff. And what's my contribution to society? Oh, I don't know. Raising a kid, writing books, and teaching classes. So I have written a couple books. I wrote a book about young earth creationism called The Heresy of Ham. So I still like that title. I like the alliteration.
Ham and cheese.
And that came out in 2016. And then just about a month or two ago, when was it? May? I came out with Christianity and the Revolution in Worldviews. It's kind of an overview of Western culture and philosophy and stuff from ancient Greece up to the present day. Just came out with that. So you can buy them on Amazon.com. And, what else? Translated the Bible. And I self-published that. No real publisher is going to publish that. That's just my personal thing. But I did that I started back in the late 90s just to keep up with my Greek and Hebrew, and it just kept on going. So eventually I was like, hey, I'm getting pretty close to being done. I might as well finish it up and put it in a book format. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Tell us about your conversion story and how you ended up being a Bible scholar.
All right. Well, I grew, like I said, I grew up in the Chicagoland area. I'll say, if I say Carroll Stream, nobody knows where Carroll Stream is. So I just say Wheaton, and that's like Wheaton College, famous evangelical school. That's where my parents went. That's where they met, and I grew up in Wheaton. So I grew up in a very, evangelical, background, and just a normal Christian kid in the 80s. So in that sense, I grew up in a Christian home. I would say, so in one sense, I've always been a Christian. That's always been that there. But for me personally, I think it was between the summer between my junior and senior years of high school, I kind of had that crisis of, do I really believe this stuff? When you get late teens, you start questioning things. Do I really believe this stuff? And so it was at that time, that would have been the summer of 1986. I kind of had my crisis of faith, and I started thinking things through. And my sister, who was also she was a couple years older than me, she was kind of thinking things through as well. And she turned me on to C.S. Lewis' Mere Christianity. And so I read that summer. And I didn't tell anybody, but in my mind, I was like, I'm an agnostic this summer. I don't know what I believe. I want to read this book and see if there's enough to Christianity that makes sense for me to keep pursuing it. So I read that. And I also got into the music of Sting. He's still my favorite of all time.
Yeah, the band leader of the Police.
Yes. He had just gone solo, and his Dream of the Blue Turtles album, for me, it was what everybody has their different albums that are just like, it's changed the way I viewed the world. And so basically that summer I read C.S. Lewis and I listened to Sting, Dream of the Blue Turtles. And that was my conversion. And ever since then, I just kind of have just been pursuing, my faith. But ever since then, I've never felt completely at home, whether it was my Christian high school from that point on or various churches. I'm part of it, but there's just, I don't know, when you're really trying to live out your faith, and it's kind of a journey, sometimes you don't feel at home in various churches even, it kind of depends. But I ended up becoming a biblical scholar by, I guess it started this way. In the mid 90s, right after I graduated college, I substitute taught for 2 years, which was like the worst thing ever. Nobody should be forced to do that. No. And so I couldn't get a full-time job, and I kind of hated my life, blah, 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 early 20s kind of thing. And so I decided to join the Peace Corps, and I ended up living in Kazakhstan, which is literally like Central Asia, right next to China. And it was kind of an epiphany. It was a specific moment. This is my little epiphany story. I was in the city of Karaganda in my room, writing a letter to my parents about how, now I was in the Peace Corps, and I don't know if I want to do this. I'm just kind of agonizing over my life. And it just so happened, it was October of whatever year that was. And when you're in the Peace Corps, you don't have a lot of stuff. And so I happened to be listening to a Christmas tape that another Peace Corps member had given me in October. And in the middle of writing this letter to my parents, the song "O Come, Emmanuel" came out. It was like a string quartet, and it was like a light bulb went off in my head. And basically, I realized ever since I was a little kid, I was always interested in Bible stories and biblical things. At that point, I realized I want to go back home. After I leave the Peace Corps, I want to go back home. I want to find some kind of Christian graduate school, and I want to really study the Bible just to learn it. Because, if you've grown up going to church, a lot of people know the Sunday school Bible stories, but they really don't know a lot of it. And I just decided I really want to learn just for the sake of learning. And actually, it was that year in the Peace Corps that I decided to read through the Bible for the first time. And again, in my mind, I thought, I'm going to read through the Bible as if not like it was the Holy Bible or anything, but just like I'm just going to read through it like it was any other book and interact with it, ask questions about it, write my questions down. And it was that year that I read through it on my own that it really became even more interesting. And from there, I did my master's program and I got a few master's degrees and then I got my PhD, and it just, I was content teaching high school though, but then through a string of events, I'm no longer teaching high school. And so I kind of stumbled into becoming a biblical scholar at the university level, but that's it in a nutshell. Kind of a big nutshell, actually.
It was nice knowing that. All right. Oh, you go, Engine.
You go.
Oh yeah, I just found that interesting. I was especially found it interesting when you're going into the Old Testament and how I believe you corrected Christians more on how they interpreted Jesus fulfilling prophecies of the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
Where I remember you went over the Isaiah 7:14 with the verse.
Yeah, I did I did my PhD thesis on Isaiah 7:14. I wrote like 300 pages on it. So, but yeah, I think that was one of the things that I've come to understand, because most people, when they think prophecy, they think of it as just kind of a prediction of the far off future that eventually comes true, like Nostradamus kind of thing. But obviously, when I was doing my studies, it occurred to me that, like let's take Isaiah 7:14 for example, and that's behold, the virgin who will be with child, name him Emmanuel stuff. I probably should be able to quote it like perfectly after having written 300 pages on it, but I just always paraphrase things. Most Christians think, oh, that Isaiah predicted the virgin birth, and they just kind of held on to this prediction for 750 years. Well, when you really think of it, if after a couple hundred years of a prediction doesn't come true, they're going to disregard it, But then when you read Isaiah 7:14, it's in chapter 7, and you always have to consider the context. And the context of Isaiah 7 is something called the Syro-Ephraimite crisis, which was basically in roughly in the 740s BC. Judah was being Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, and a neighbor king of Aram or Syria. They basically tag teamed, and they were going to invade Judah. And the new king Ahaz was freaking out. And so when you read chapter 7, that's what we're told. These two countries are going to invade Judah, and Ahaz is scared. And Isaiah comes to Ahaz and he says, don't be scared. Put your faith in Yahweh. In fact, ask for any kind of sign you want, and he'll do it for you. Just put your faith in Yahweh. And Ahaz's response is like, nah, I don't think so. I think I'm going to call up Sennacherib. Not Sennacherib. It's the king of Assyria, Tiglath-Pileser. I think I'm going to get his help. So basically, I'm going to ask the local mob boss for help. And it's at that point that Isaiah basically says, you're ticking God off, you moron. He's going to give you a sign anyway. Then he goes into, behold, the Alma is with child. She'll give birth. And by the time he grows up, Assyria is going to get its butt kicked. When you look into the context, it has an original context. And then when you look at the larger context of that history, Hezekiah, who is Ahaz's son, he's the one who puts his faith in Yahweh, and it's through his faith in Yahweh during Sennacherib's invasion that Assyria gets their butt kicked. That's why it
was then that the angel of the of the Lord struck the Assyrians with plague.
Yeah, exactly. And that happened within the next generation. And what I say in my PhD thesis is that's why we have Isaiah 7:14 still, because back then they kept the prophecies of the prophets whose prophecies have come true, and they were vindicated as true prophets of Yahweh. And so they kept that prophecy. And then when you get to the New Testament, when Matthew quotes it, he's not saying, hey, we've had this prophecy lying around for 750 years. It's now come true. He's saying, let me tell you the significance of who Jesus is. He's pointing to Isaiah 7:14. It's like that, but bigger. It's basically, and that's when you think about a fulfillment means, you think, I just saw you were drinking something, think of a glass, think of like the bottom glass down here is like Abraham, and then another line, Moses. Each rung is something in Israel's history. And then the top is Jesus. There you go. And then as throughout the history, God's purposes are being fulfilled. And then when Jesus comes, the New Testament writers feel like we can refer to anything back in the Old Testament and show how Jesus is the fulfillment of that. It's not a prediction that's just waiting to come true. It had an original context, and now Jesus is like that, but bigger. So,
and there's also some controversy about the. Some scholars would also say they preserved unfulfilled prophecies, like the destruction of Tyre and Ezekiel.
Yeah, I think there's parts of that. Yeah, but I mean, there's always elements of that. But I think we have to realize that when we come to Old Testament prophecies, particularly Old Testament, the messianic prophecies that the New Testament writers allude to, for the most part, if you look at the original context, basically the New Testament writers are saying, understand Jesus against the backdrop of that Old Testament context. He's like that, but bigger. That's the easiest way to say it. So what you were saying is the understanding of fulfilled prophecy, I think, is often misunderstood as just like Nostradamus prediction, and there's a lot more to it. It's really a matter of reading the New Testament. Whenever the New Testament alludes to an Old Testament prophecy or something, you want to see what the connection is. It's not just a prediction. It's the New Testament writers inviting you to say, look back at that story, understand that, and then interpret Jesus in light of that.
And many would argue that certain Old Testament prophecies had dual meanings, or particularly the messianic prophecies.
Yeah, and I think, but the thing is, I think the thing to remember is, at the time, let's say if you went back to the Sennacherib's invasion, they would have seen Isaiah's prophecy as that's the meaning they knew. And for 750 years, nobody read that prophecy any other way. And then in the New Testament, when Matthew quotes it, he's like saying, hey, there's an additional meaning to this prophecy fulfilled in Jesus, but it wasn't like people throughout ancient Israel knew about that at that point yet until Jesus came on the scene. That make sense?
Yeah.
So from our perspective, it's dual meaning, yes.
What's your take on the Isaiah? Speaking of Isaiah, what's your take on Isaiah 14, Lucifer, or the Hello Ben Shakar?
Yeah, I think is it 14? It's the context is pretty much Babylon. I mean, it's right.
Yeah, supposed to be alluding the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, or whichever.
Yeah, I don't know if it's specifically. I mean, obviously, later on in the context of Isaiah, you see that as a Nebuchadnezzar, sure. But at that time, it's just the king of Babylon. It's a prophecy that Babylon will be destroyed. I think later writers, I don't know if it's in the New Testament or maybe later Christian theologians read that and they equate it with Satan.
Yeah, because Jesus said, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven.
Yeah, he kind of alludes to it partly. So again, I think this is where a lot of times when you read the Bible, you have, again, this is the literature major part of it. You have to realize that there's literary things going on. So when Jesus says that, I don't think he's hey, that chapter in Isaiah really is about Satan himself in a literal way. I think he's alluding to that chapter to illustrate what he feels is the ultimate dark power in the universe, if you know what I mean.
Because there also seems to be a apparent connection with Canaanite religion. Story of it usurping the God's throne.
Yeah, I mean, it could be. Anytime you live in a culture, we naturally make comments that are common to our culture that we just do. That's how things work, in my opinion. It doesn't bother me though.
What's been the most interesting aspects about your profession?
Well, teaching high school, I think the most interesting part is, after having done my my biblical studies degrees and stuff, most people who, once they do, a PhD, they want to be a specialist in college and they don't want to talk to the little people, and just the way things worked out, I ended up teaching in high school. And in a way, it was really good because I was forced, even though my specialty was Isaiah 7:14, that's the scholarly thing, is just to be obsessed over one little micromanaged point in the Bible. But then you kind of forget there's a broader context. And so been teaching not English, high school, and I taught an intro Old Testament class to freshmen in high school for 8 years, where I had to go through the entire Old Testament and kind of teach it to them in a comprehensive manner. It actually forced me to understand the larger context of the Bible, not just my own little area of my own area of specialty. Area of specialty, is that the right way to say it? Area of expertise. That's what I was going for.
Area of expertise, yeah.
Yeah, I knew that sounded wrong. And so in a way, that was a very fulfilling thing. It forced me to get that bigger context of not just the Old Testament, but also the New Testament as a whole. So now when I go to anything specific in the Bible, I have that really good comprehensive understanding of the whole picture as a whole, back against which I can do things. And so that's a very interesting aspect. Now that I get to teach high school, that's just nicer because I get to teach kids who are like in their 20s and they're not 14. So it's a lot easier to teach now. That's just nice. But
Yeah.
Sorry.
All right. Tell us about your opinion on biblical inerrancy, or to what extent the biblical texts are inspired.
Basically, I think I've done a couple blog posts on the inerrancy question, and I think a lot of people, they think inspiration, inerrancy, infallibility, it's all the same. It's the Bible's special, that kind of thing. Most common people think about it at that level. God did it ultimately. I think the Bible is inspired. I mean, that's the thing. I think discussion of inerrancy or infallibility, I think, is often misguided. And when you know the history of where that term came, do you know where the history of that term came from?
The history of the term what?
Like inerrancy, infallibility.
Yeah, sola scriptura, the Protestants.
Yeah, it was kind of sola scriptura, the Protestant thing, but specifically in inerrancy really was I don't know if it was late 19th century or early 20th century reaction against liberal theology, which again is like next part of your question that you gave me, the JEPD source criticism. In the 19th century, with the rise of historical criticism, more and more people were saying, well, that didn't really happen. That didn't happen. That kind of stuff. And this ties in with evolution and stuff. And therefore, because of that, some more fundamentalists, of course, it's funny, in the early 20th century, the fundamentalists were actually academics. They weren't like, I might disagree with them, but they weren't nuts like the modern ones are.
Yeah.
They wanted to kind of protect the Bible against these attacks from liberal theology that said miracles don't happen. And so the Bible isn't just inspired, but it's inerrant. It's without error in whatever it affirms. Now, okay, sure. But what happened very quickly, unfortunately, is that inerrancy idea became more of, and this is what you get with Ken Ham and the young earth creationists, the Bible's true and it's historically and scientifically accurate in everything. 6 days of creation 6,000 years ago because the Bible said, they kind of go off on that tangent.
This was like during the Middle Ages that there's this one scholar, William of Conscious, that thought about this reading Genesis. So, like looking at the sun being created on the fourth day, like how can you have sun before day? Like, this is not a literal book.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. If you read a lot of early church fathers and all the way back for the last 2,000 years, it's not like these questions are brand new to us. Like you said, yeah. I mean, you read a lot of them. They understood, hey, there's something else going on here. They still affirmed the Bible, but they didn't read it with this cold wooden literalism from cover to cover, like, you know.
Well, yeah. I mean, Augustine himself, from what I can tell, it was Augustine, Origen. I know like some more of them, but they all basically held to like not the whole like wooden literalism that we typically get today.
Yeah.
With the Earth creationists. Like, because, yeah, you're right, they ask the same questions like you see many atheists use today. Is like, they say it's a got you question. Like, you fundy Christians, you've never heard this. I'm like, not just have Christians heard it, they invented it. They were the first ones to ask it.
Yeah. Actually, some of the most, whether it's like Origen has some hilarious quotes. Again, I'm only going to be paraphrasing them, but Origen says something like about the Adam and Eve story, like, only an idiot would believe that God got like literally on his hands and knees in a sandbox, and isn't this early church father? And so, yeah, and the thing is, even then, a lot of the early church fathers, when they were wrestling with those early chapters, their discussions were based in a context of dealing with Greek philosophy, so they were trying to answer those questions through it, whereas, you know, modern young earth creationists are trying to answer scientific questions. And, you know, that's why understanding the original context of these chapters and where they came from is so important. And in that case, you know, you have to understand the ancient Near Eastern context and how they wrote things back then. But so back to your question, I would say, for me, the Bible is inspired and the Bible is true. And that's good enough for me. Anybody who tries to say, oh, but it's also infallible and inerrant, I hear them saying it's really, really, really true. Like, okay, sure, but you're just being redundant. You know?
Like, inspiration doesn't equal dictation.
I don't. I mean, yeah, it's not meant to be read as strict literal history from cover to cover. Parts of it are historical, parts of it aren't, and you have to be a good reader, you have to be literarily competent to know the difference. You know, so when you have that typical argument, ironically, by new atheists and both new atheists and young Earth creationists make the same argument. Well, if you don't believe that Adam and Eve are historical, then
no need for Jesus.
Yeah, you're like, well, how can you tell the difference? I don't know, because I know how to read. It's not that hard. And so
it's a slippery. See,
yeah, the slippery slope. Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, and here's I always tell them the Bible is the only literary work that they use that sort of methodology with. I have never seen an atheist say, "Oh, well, Shakespeare put a metaphor in this one thing, so therefore the entire thing is fake."
Yeah, but I think it goes back to, and this happens with both atheists, believers, and everything in between, is because we all come to the Bible with this assumption, oh, this is the Holy Bible. And so therefore there's that, in everybody's mind, there's that question. And in our day and age, because we're so dominated by, science, it's just this natural assumption, like, well, if God really is behind it, everything has to be scientifically accurate, because that's what we value in our society. And, that's not necessarily true. Truth comes in all forms, not just scientific facts. Truth comes in through poems and stories and a whole bunch of stuff. And if you limit the Bible to being it just has to be historical facts and scientific facts all the way through, you're misunderstanding it and you're devaluing it. And I would argue the most important truths about what it means to be human doesn't come from scientific facts. It comes from, the arts and literature and poetry, and, those are the things that move us. That's why we read novels and we don't read textbooks for fun,
Also,
So,
do you go, while we're on that subject, do you go for the JEPD theory when it comes to the Torah, or the fragmentary view, or supplementary, or a bit of all three?
I basically, and this is kind of similar to like the New Testament issue of Q, the source. I have no problem saying that the Torah came from various sources, and JEPD could be representative of sources, but it's when scholars start treating them as actual documents. There was a J document. We don't have the document. It's complete speculation. You don't know that, and I think sometimes scholars go too far with it. Same thing with Q in the New Testament. Mark is generally assumed to be the earliest gospel, and he didn't write it out. He didn't write it whole cloth. He obviously got previous sources and material from the previous 30, 40 years of the early church and put it together in his gospel. If you want to call that Q as in Q material, okay, but that's not a Q document. It's not a J document. And I think, and too often because I teach Old Testament introduction at the college level, a lot of Old Testament introduction books, scholarly Old Testament introduction books, and this really bugs me, is they don't treat the books of the Old Testament as books. They don't say, okay, this is what Genesis is about, and this is how it flows together. All they do is like, well, in these chapters of Genesis, we know these verses are from J, and these are from E, and this is from P. Okay, great. But we don't know that, and they've kind of ignored what Genesis is about or what Exodus is about. So, JEPD material, sure, but you can't say they're documents. Well, actually, D you can, because D everybody acknowledges as Deuteronomy. But but yeah, material, yes. Documents, that's speculative, basically.
What's your take on the widespread theory in biblical scholarship, which has been consensus for decades, apparently, that Yahweh was a desert storm god or warrior god?
I don't know. I mean, this is where it's funny because, a lot of more fundamentalist types think I'm liberal, and a lot of liberals think I'm too conservative. Like I, for one,
can't please anybody.
No. I joke about like I'm where Jesus is. I think, for example, I mean, I fully acknowledge that a lot of the Old Testament writings, whether it's in Genesis or Exodus or those early stuff, I think that there's a historical root, but they're also literarily composed. And so I totally acknowledge the literary and cultural significance of how they're composed. But at the same time, I think there was some sort of Exodus. It might not have been, I don't think Exodus was we shouldn't read Exodus as Cecil B. DeMille's 10 Commandments was a documentary. Right. But I think there were Hebrew slaves who escaped and who were called by, and I obviously think, Yahweh is the real God, and it happened in some format. We're reading an account of it that has been kind of literally, put together. But I still think, there was some historical nugget to that. And so obviously they're going to understand who Yahweh is kind of through the lens of their culture, and Yahweh is presented as a warrior, as a man of war. And so they're going to describe him with the kind of language that they're familiar with. So I don't think they just made him up from a Canaanite god, but in their description of him, they're going to use language that they're familiar with.
Like the most of the leading proponents of this theory are Christians and Jews, scholars who are just relaying what the Israelites believed.
Mm-hmm.
But also like the most militant of rabid atheists will go along with the caricature of the situation, which goes that the originally Canaanite Israelites apparently chose this one god to be their own because.
Yeah.
And use that as a gotcha.
Yeah, I don't, and that's the thing. I don't agree with that. I mean, I really think that when they really came out of Egypt and they had some kind of encounter at Sinai, wherever Sinai is. Um, so I don't think just Canaanites made up the God. I think the belief in Yahweh came from the Hebrews as they moved into Canaan. But call me just conservative, I guess. So
Then there's also the Yahweh from the South tradition.
Oh, Mount Sinai in Utah.
in Utah.
Oh yeah, Brass. Our mutual
Well,
friend, Biblical History Skeptic, says to turn down your volume. You're blasting the audience.
All right.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, that the question of the location of Sinai is always kind of interesting. There's people have different views. I, to me, I still think the one that's most intriguing to me is the one, I don't know how familiar you are with it, but Jabal al-Lawz in Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that makes sense to me. I mean, again, it's not going to make or break it, but
it definitely wasn't Jabal al-Musa.
Right. I mean, and just the cool thing about Jabal al-Lawz is when you think of how far they would have been going per day, you can kind of map out generally about how far they would be in a certain amount of time period. And there's a lot of stuff, that's intriguing that would point to that. But,
I like saying that personally, that the Garden of Eden was actually in Iraq, because the idea that the American government, like apparently with a religious right, went to the Garden of Eden essentially to kill Muslims. It's sort of funnier to think about it like that.
actually, I mean, I think
Volume, Brass.
if you've read my posts and stuff, you know that I think Genesis 1 through 11 is not meant to be taken as literal history. I use the scholarly term mythology, not like Richard Carrier means it, but the actual academic understanding of what that is. But I think the ancient Israel viewed the Promised Land as kind of Eden-like, and there's a lot of things going into it. I'll just give you one. Yeah, but when when Joshua and Israel, they crossed the Jordan River, and there's this bit in, I think, chapter 5 or chapter 6 where Joshua encounters the commander of the armies of the Lord.
Yeah,
it's an angel with a big sword. Well, think about it. Like, he's on the edge of the Promised Land, and he encounters an angel with a sword. You go back to the Eden story, when Adam and Eve are exiled, God places an angel at the edge to guard it. So there's a lot of literary things, and I think it's set up as to show that going to the Promised Land is kind of like going to Eden.
And in over time in Judges, which was a reverse narrative to Joshua, it was they managed to turn their Eden into Sodom.
Oh yeah, that whole story, the Levite and the concubine story. Oh my gosh. I love going over that story, especially with high school kids, because it freaks them out. But then when you point out that the way that's in Judges 19, I think, the way it's told, it's the Sodom and Gomorrah story, and the shocker is that Sodom and Gomorrah got destroyed because obviously those evil pagans are so blah. But then the shocker in Judges is that this happens within Israel with a Levite. They're worse than Sodom and Gomorrah, So, and that's another good example how they're telling part of the story of their history against, they're making that allusion to make a theological point.
And Judges is also filled with satire.
Oh, Judges is one of my favorite Old Testament books. I would never want to see it in a movie, like for real, because it'd be too disgusting. But I love reading.
Well, they try with Samson. They model him as a Hebrew Hercules.
Yeah. There's a lot of stories in the Bible that people misunderstand. Like with Samson. Oh, he was God gave him strength, but he was just a playboy all the way through. But when you actually read it,
he was the worst of all the judges. He was the most corrupt.
Well, yes and no, but you can read this on your own. Let me tell you something here. When you read the beginning, he's after there's a chapter, is it 17, 16? I can't remember, 13. When the angel appears to his mother and, hey, you're going to give a birth. anyway, the next two chapters, the whole story is about him going down to Philistine territory, getting the Philistine wife, all that stuff. Everything in those, I think it's first two chapters of his story, every time he does something, we're specifically told the Spirit of Yahweh rushed upon him to empower him to do it. And so even though he was doing things that were shocking, you're not supposed to marry a Philistine wife, but we're told that basically God told him to, in a sense. So he's doing the work of Yahweh to fight against the Philistines. But it changes in that last chapter when he goes, then he went down to Gaza and he went and saw a prostitute. No mention of Yahweh telling him that. And then with Delilah. And so what you see in that last chapter, Yahweh isn't mentioned at all. And you see that it's at that point that he starts having too much confidence in himself. And it's only at the end, after he gets captured and hair cut off, he calls out to Yahweh once again, and Yahweh returns to him. But he has that bad chapter where he's doing horrible things. But a lot of that early stuff with the Philistine wife and all that stuff, he's actually doing what God wants him. So he's a very complicated figure. But yeah, all of them are screwed
and
up.
like David especially, you get two different pictures of him. You get this thuggish mob boss like tribal chieftain who becomes king and then abuses his power, and then you got the idea that he was a man after God's own heart.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the David story is basically 2 Samuel. I mean, that's another amazing narrative work because his character really is so complex. In some ways, he does stuff that's worse than Saul, but in other ways, he what makes him a man after God's own heart is when he's confronted with his sin. Unlike Saul, he goes, "Yeah, I deserve it," and he takes the punishment and he doesn't try to find excuses and stuff. But another interesting thing about the David story, when you think about it, it said that he reigned for 40 years, and most of 2 Samuel, starting with, I think it's 2 Samuel 11 with the David and Bathsheba story, all the way to the end, it really focuses on, it's amazing when you think about it, 40 years of reigning, and we're just told about a handful of things in his whole reign, which is fascinating. But
40 was also a symbolic number throughout the Old Testament.
Yeah. But it's just amazing that when you think about however long his reign was, what 2 Samuel focuses on is really a select tidbits from his whole reign.
Yeah, and Chronicles totally whitewashes his character to where they take out all the bad parts that we see in Samuel.
Yeah, and the reason, and there's another academic reason why, is because it's believed that 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings were probably written or compiled during the exile, right? And so therefore, in the exile, the natural question that the Jews have is, how did we get here? I thought we were God's people. And so when you read Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, they have a lot of bad stuff in them because it's basically like, this is why you're in exile. Look at your whole history. You're a bunch of screw ups, but then when you get to 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which was a post-exilic work.
Yeah, like in the Persian period.
Yeah, they're back in the land. They're obviously not doing so well. This is kind of a pick-me-up. Like, hey, look, the purpose of 1st and 2nd Chronicles was to say, well, look back at your history. David, he wanted to build the temple. It's kind of a pep talk, so it's a different motive for both, even though 1st and 2nd Chronicles is almost very much like those other books. It's very much more positive because,
Judaism reformed itself from the Israelite religions, and then after, how long afterwards they went back to their old ways, like deifying Moses and Elijah and them, and
well, it's funny when you think about it. If you're Jewish and you're reading your Old Testament, it's kind of funny because you think in most religions, their holy books are going to tell them how great their ancestors were and we're special people. If you're a Jew and you're reading the Old Testament, that is a very humbling experience. It's like, oh my gosh, we are always screwing up. So yeah.
That's what makes them unique. They always manage to record their fuck ups and
Well, I mean, just remember, even Moses told his people to shut up when they were crossing the river.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's that's to me.
Moses won them dead at one point.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's a story of conflict, and in actuality, I mean, do you know what the word Israel means?
Struggle with God, or God
Yeah.
contends, or
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's what Israel is. They're God's chosen people, and He, come on, get in the wrestling ring with me and wrestle with me, and that's what the whole Old Testament. That's what it's about. It's very fascinating.
what has been your experience dealing with both fundamentals and anti-theists?
Did you make up that name, fundamentals?
Yep, fundamentalist evangelicals.
It's hard for me to say. What has been my experience? Oh my gosh. Well, it's kind of yeah. Like I said, I grew up in the evangelical world. You know, I kind of grew up in Wheaton. You know,
I'm sorry.
But it's a complicated thing. Like, for the most part, like in the '80s, the evangelical movement in the '80s, you know, you're always going to have your nutballs, you know, in any movement. But my family and close friends, I kind of assumed everybody was normal, you know.
The 80s and the 90s seem to be better times for everybody.
But my experience with that kind of more what I call, you know, ultra fundamentalist, you know, if you've read parts of my blog, I kind of had two bad experiences at two schools over, ironically, the creation evolution thing. Both of them happened before I even knew much about it. And I won't go into detail, but basically, these other two evangelical schools I taught at, most of the time I was there, it was great. But then when a new headmaster came in, who was kind of more zealous, my views seemed to stray from the party line, because I wasn't like, Genesis 1 through 11 has to be historical all the way through. So my experience with that was tough, because I lost two jobs over it. And actually, if you read my Heresy of Ham book, I go into a little bit of the autobiography of that at the very beginning of the book. I'll elaborate on that because it's in the book. This was, you know, back in 2014, I think. My seniors, I taught a worldview class, and part of the worldview class is we had, you know, it's like overview of Western culture. So we would have a unit on Marx and a unit on Freud, and kind of try to get them ready for college. You know, that's a bigger level thing. I also had a unit on Darwin, because he's, like him or not, he's the really influential person.
Yeah, the most influential person from the 19th century besides Marx.
Yeah, exactly. And at that point, when I started the unit, I think in 2009. At that point, if you would have asked me if I believe in evolution, I would have said no, because I hated science anyway. It wasn't my thing. I just kind of went with the standard evangelical, evolution is atheism. But in the process of making that unit, what my goal was to present to the students all the various views, and then just have them discuss, because that's what worldview is supposed to be. So I think this is what old Earth creationism is. That's what young Earth creationism says. This is what I call atheistic evolution, like the Dawkins kind of style, and then theistic evolution. I just kind of presented all the arguments, and in the process of that, I started learning it a little bit, and you know, over time, I'm like, hey, this isn't that nutty. But anyway, when the new headmaster came in, that's right when the Ken Ham Bill Nye debate happened.
Yeah.
And at that point, I knew I didn't agree with Ken Ham. Did I say Bill Ham? No, I said Ken Ham. At that point, when that debate happened, I knew enough that I thought young Earth creationism was nutty. In fact, I'd come to the conclusion that Genesis 1 through 11 wasn't historical back in the late 90s. I mean, long before I even cared about the creation evolution debate. But anyway, so when that debate happened, I watched it, and then I ended up writing a whole bunch of blog posts just critiquing the debate. And it was clear that I thought Ken Ham was wrong on the issue of the debate. Well, that new headmaster read my post, and basically he decided that I wasn't a good fit for the school anymore, and he kind of let me go. And so that wasn't fun. But at the same time, I knew that obviously not all Christians are that idiotic. And even, I mean, growing up in the evangelical world, not all evangelicals are what? Oh, I mean, I knew most evangelicals aren't that nutty either. Most evangelicals I know growing up, they really don't know about the issue, and they really don't care about the issue. You know,
Right.
They might say, "Oh, I don't believe in evolution," but they haven't looked at it and they don't care. That doesn't affect their life. But those zealous ones, like the Ken Ham acolytes, they really are dangerous people because they think they're doing it for the right, for the good cause, and really, they're pretty bad people in my opinion. So,
And their equivalents, such as Dawkins, Hitchens, Harris, Dillahunty, Aaron Rod, acolytes.
yeah, and it's funny because, and this is one of the things I've said in my blog probably many times, and I've said it with my Jerry Coin post, is so that happened. That was my experience with the fundagelicals. How do you say that?
Fundagelicals.
Fundagelicals. Okay. That was my experience with those kind. And then since then, the last 5 years, having written the book and writing my blog posts and critiquing these new atheist books, and online, I'm getting into some debates with some of those kind of extremist acolytes. It's so shocking. No, it's not shocking, but it's so telling how much alike young earth creationists and militant atheists really are. They're each other's doppelganger. They use the same kind of logic. They often make the same arguments. Obviously, they come to different conclusions, but it's the same tactics and everything. And it's really fascinating to watch. I think was it my last post on Jerry Coyne? I had some quotes, and I say, guess who said this quote, Jerry Coyne or Ken Ham? And I had like 4 quotes, and like you could not.
Yeah, half of them came from Ken. Like you couldn't tell the difference because half came from Ken and half of them came from Coyne.
Yeah, I mean it's the exact same argumentation, and they both hate theistic evolutionists or people like me, because I don't fit in their nice little, cubby holes, I guess. But so yeah, I think I call them. I've said for the longest time, like Ken Ham and Richard Dawkins, they're each other's doppelganger. They're the same person, just so it's really
only one slightly smarter than the other.
Yeah, that's a tough call though. I mean, at least Dawkins knows what evolution is.
Yeah.
He just conflates it with.
He just hasn't contributed to science in decades.
Yeah, and his whole mentality as a coin. I have a PhD in evolutionary biology, therefore I'm totally certified to speak authoritatively on the Bible and theology and church history.
No.
So, yeah. So there, it's best to stay away from both camps. If you're getting hit by both camps, you're probably right where you should be.
It's like Bart Ehrman says, like, if you got lunatics on both sides screeching about how wrong you are, you must be doing something right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's very true.
And speaking about your strong stance against young earth creationism, like, after wasting hours and days dealing with nutty Christ mythers, you are 100% correct when you compare them to young earth creationists. 100% correct.
Yeah, it really is. I want to write another book at some point where I kind of focus on how alike they are. Actually, I'll tell you this. I want to use this for the title for the book, but I can't because in Australia it's really vulgar. It was basically a couple of years ago. I was in an online debate with some atheists who liked Richard Carrier and blah blah blah, and it was a long story short. It started with I was criticizing Ken Ham, and they jumped on. They agreed with me. Then they said that some other stuff, and I said, "Well, that's not quite true." And then it just kind of evolved into like this week-long, debate. And one of the atheists was this lady from Australia, I think, and she, just started like really being vulgar and cussing me out, but with her Australian cuss words.
Yeah.
And she started calling me a cockwaddle, which to me, that means nothing, but apparently in Australia, that's really bad. So I had this idea. It's like, I so want to have a book where I talk about how the young earth creationists, fundamentalists, and new atheists, mythicists are so much alike. I wanted to call it like the cockwaddle conspiracy, but I don't think that would work. So I got to think of another name.
You should get that
Just
up.
I know what you call it. Just call it the Cosmic Sperm Bank.
You should get that for peer review.
Yeah. Well, that's still a ways away. I have a few other writing projects that I'm working on now. I'm trying to do an Old Testament intro book and a New Testament intro book, and then
Like all the time, I see more and more clear indications that mythicism is becoming a fanatical cult.
oh yeah, oh no doubt. I mean, I can't believe. Actually, what was it? A couple months ago, I think in April, I did a debate with Dan Barker at my college. It's my first actual debate. I'd give myself a C. I did okay, but I don't think it was great. But at one point, the mythicist issue came up, and I probably said this in a blog, but I basically said, okay, well, how did I put it? I basically said, okay, mythicism is to history what flat eartherism is to science.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's that kind of just nuttiness. It's like if you could say you don't believe Jesus is God, and okay, I understand that. I might disagree, but if you don't think he existed, you are a moron.
And there's this one guy that who was debating Bart Ehrman I think it was a while back, and somebody in the audience asked him about Jesus' existence, and he said to them, I can't remember the guy's name, but he said to them, like, you can be an atheist, it's okay, you just can't be a stupid atheist.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, and I don't understand how people can come to that conclusion.
It's psychological. Reason has little to nothing to do with it.
Yeah, it's kind of like people who think we faked the moon landing and flat earthers. It's kind of a weird psychosis.
I think it is that when you have a group of people that hate something so much, they just want the entire thing to be as false as possible.
Yeah.
Even if it means you have to go into absurdities to make it more false.
That's very true. Yeah, and you see that with mythicisms, and then again you see that with people like Ken Ham. They say some stuff that's just insane, But yeah, it's very true.
I mean, you have to just remember, man, that a pine tree can give birth to an elephant.
Oh yeah, obviously. Yeah, I remember when I first started at the high school. My last high school. I started there in 2007. I think in 2008 there was a student, and she gave me this video by this guy named Ken Ham. She's like, "Oh, my dad really likes him," and I looked at. I had never heard of him before, and I watched the video. And again, I grew up in Wheaton, Illinois, within evangelicalism. And all of a sudden I hear this Ken Ham guy, and he's making these claims about the Bible. And I'm like, this is absurd. I mean, and I grew up in evangelicalism. It had nothing to do with the evangelicalism I grew up in. But yeah, it's really interesting how that is. But anyway.
All right.
Yeah, what's the experience been all around?
Of what?
Dealing with the young earth creationists and Christ mythers.
Oh, I got at this point it gets kind of tiresome. When you're first getting into it and you're learning about them, it's kind of fascinating to learn because it's so nutty, But after a while, like I can't remember I think earlier this spring I did a few posts on something Ken Ham said. But when I started my blog in 2015, I was writing about Ken Ham a lot because I was researching my book, and it was like. But in the last year and a half, it's just you get to the point where like, what's the point of writing about them? It's once you figure them out, it's just the same old, same old.
Like you can't reason somebody out of a position they didn't reason themselves into.
No, you can't. And I think even doing this Jerry Coyne book, it's interesting. but I'm really looking forward to finishing the book analysis because it gets kind of tiring to point out the same absurdities over and over again, the same lame arguments, like, no, he's wrong here, he's wrong here. Once you figure them out, it's not.
Well, I mean, obviously, like, obviously, you believe that sin conquers all because you believe you put sin before Adam.
Well, I mean, the thing is, and that's another thing, and it came to like bring it around to the Mere Christianity book by C.S. Lewis. At one point, he talks about people who throw up such an absurd caricature of God and then attack that, and if that's all of Christianity, and then as soon as you try to explain it's a little more complex than your stupid caricature, they start complaining about how there really was a God. He would make things easy. And C.S. Lewis said something like, whenever you beat people like that, it's best just to you're just wasting your time. Once you realize that's what they're doing,
Like these rabid anti-theists will tell you that they used to be Christians. Like about 95% of them will tell you they used to be Christians or devout Christians. But if they're not lying, you can tell that they came from these extreme right-wing fundamental groups. But then they'll turn around and say that you worship a sky daddy. Like, you worshiped the sky daddy when you were a Christian?
Yeah. Well, that is very telling, because a lot of them, like Dan Barker, they used to be those ultra fundamentalist types with a very simplistic, not critical way to assess things. And then at some point they realize that's wrong, but then so they go to the other end of the spectrum, but they maintain that same mindset because that's how they process things. And it's, in a way, it's kind of sad because they don't see it, but
it gets amusing at first and then it gets sad.
Yeah. It's very intriguing. It's at first it's fun to argue with it because you're making your argument.
Yeah.
But after a while, it's like it does get sad. So yeah, when I finish the joint Jerry Coyne book, I'm going to look forward to maybe doing some other posts that might be a little more, I don't know, I want to say uplifting, but just not so depressing.
You might want to take a sabbatical before responding to Goodbye Jesus.
Yeah, probably. Well, I did the Dawkins, Hitchinson, Harris book, a good 8 years ago, and then took a break, and then really this year I did 2 Dan Barker books and the Jerry Coyne book. So yeah, probably for this year I'm probably new atheist out for this year. I catch my breath. Maybe I'll do something later, but I mean, people enjoy what I write about that stuff because I think a lot of people, when they read or they come across those type of arguments, they know there's something wrong with those arguments, but they don't know how to address them. It's the same thing with a lot of even fundamentalist arguments, or how they read things. So what I like to think what I'm doing that's helpful is I'm reading the book and I'm teasing things out and I'm making arguments of what's wrong about it. And so hopefully people read my blogs and they go, okay, yeah, that is right. That's what's wrong with that. I can articulate that. So hopefully it's doing some good.
Yeah. Any questions, Brass?
No, I'm actually pretty good. It was nice being able to get Joel's views on a lot more stuff. It was interesting, got to learn some more stuff. What about you?
Time to read the live chat for a while.
Time to what?
Time to read the live chat for a while. Questions, comments?
Oh, I can't see any of them.
I'll read them.
Okay.
Utopia Buster says, I know how you feel. Hard finding a church with people who actually are cool and intellectually stimulating.
Yeah. Well, my journey in that regard is, I won't go into the whole journey, but basically back in 2005, when I was living in Little Rock, I started going to a Greek Orthodox church. And I loved that. Again, maybe it's the artistic, poetic, literary side, but the icons and the incense, and just the thing I like about the Orthodox Church is that it just focuses on those, I would call, creedal fundamentals of the faith. They don't get into, all that other stuff. And so I actually joined the Orthodox Church back in 2006. But then a year later, I moved to where I am now, and there's no Orthodox church within 70 miles. So I'm kind of like an Orthodox in exile. So I'm currently going to a Methodist church, which is a good little Methodist church. But yeah, I would prefer an Orthodox church. But as long as you're, for me, whoever said that, if you find yourself within a group or a church of like-minded people, you really just need a few to kind of feel at home. You don't, need tons and tons. So
You want a good Orthodox place, go to Romania or Hungary.
yeah. I would love to visit Eastern Europe and see all those things. Actually, my first taste of Orthodoxy, and I didn't realize it at that point, is when I was returning from the Peace Corps in 1994 from Kazakhstan. There was a one-day layover in Turkey and in Istanbul. And at that point, 23, 24-year-old me, I didn't know anything about church history at all. I was clueless. And so I'm in Istanbul and I'm like, hey, I think there's an old church here in Istanbul. Maybe I should check it out. Hagia Sophia, which was like the center of Orthodox Christianity for 1,000 years.
Yep.
And I didn't know anything about it. And so I kind of went up, went and did the touristy thing. And it was one of those epiphany moments. Like you walk in the door and it's this ancient church. And it was just, there was
isn't it like a museum now?
Now it's a museum and they're restoring it. And the amazing thing is because when the Turks took over in 14,
they made it a mosque.
They made it a mosque and they plastered over all the artwork. But now that it's a museum, they're taking down the plaster. And because they had plastered it, they actually had preserved it. And so as they're taking it down, the vibrant colors are now coming out. And now when I went there in 94, they hadn't started doing that as much yet. But the feeling of walking into that ancient church, it was amazing.
Like the very existence of Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire kind of destroys the new atheist caricature of the Dark Ages as being this time when when there was all darkness all the time and life sucked for everybody because the big bad church had control.
Yeah, actually, the best book I've read is by Rodney Stark called The Triumph of Christianity, and there's a few other good books. I mentioned them in my book. But
didn't Bart Ehrman write The Triumph of Christianity?
He wrote a book called The Triumph of Christianity, but that's a different book. But Rodney Stark's book is kind of a history book, and it goes throughout all that stuff. And the whole Enlightenment narrative of Dark Ages, and it's a complete farce, And so, and there's a quote by some guy, I forgot who it was, but he said something like, anybody who's going to call a time period that saw the invention of the Gothic cathedrals, universities, the beginnings of science, and he just lists all these things. Anybody who calls that the Dark Ages is mentally retarded.
Yeah.
So, but again, we often, what?
I
think you said something. But yeah, that's a good book to read. That's a good book to read.
Yeah. Rhett Quigley says the true believers of Jesus Christ are Catholics alone. Protestants did not exist before 1500 AD and therefore are heretics. Okay. Hristo Vodenechek, try saying that 5 times, followed up with Catholics split from Orthodoxy. So in short, the church got split in two. That's how I see it. Orthodoxy split from Catholics, not the other way around.
Okay.
It's distorted.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna disagree with that one, but again, I'm not one of those, like I grew up Protestant, I became Orthodox, and I know some Protestants who become Orthodox, then they want to say everybody else is a heretic. I don't think that. I think there are genuine Christians in Catholicism and Orthodoxy and Protestantism, and I think Orthodoxy preserves the heart of the early church faith better than anybody else, but I think Christians in all those branches.
Utopia.
A lot of fakers too, but
yeah.
I think you're going to be a Christian in any one of those branches.
Utopia Buster says, as John Lennox puts it, scientific axioms are descriptions, not explanations.
Yeah. I mean, what I say especially with the creation evolution debate, whenever evolution is basically describing the natural processes that gave rise to the varieties of life. That's all it does. And I think obviously in the future, we'll probably discover some stuff, and some parts of the evolutionary theory might be proven false. Some might be further verified, but we can't, too often, too many people conflate the scientific theory of evolution with philosophical naturalism as if they're the same thing, and they're not. Evolutionary theory describes those specific natural processes. That's all it does. And people who try to make it out more than that, they're really doing a disservice to everybody. So,
biblical history skeptic says Mark isn't supposed to use Q. It is Matthew and Luke, if I recall correctly.
Yeah. Yeah, right. But the basic idea is, according to the theories, that Q is the original gospel, then came Mark, then came Matthew and Luke that used both. But yeah, actually, somewhere on my blog years ago, I wrote a short blog where I kind of made fun of the theory of Q. I wrote it when I was at Regent College. Now you could probably find it somewhere. It's called the A Gospel.
Utopia Buster asks, Doc Anderson, you define Genesis 1 through 11 as mythological literature. Could you expand on that, and would you consider myth history a more accurate description?
Well, I would say, first of all, admittedly, the term myth is problematic because in our world today, in our modern culture, we think of myth as we're saying something's not true, and then Richard Carrier uses it in his own way. And again, it is a modern academic term. However, I just think it's the best term to use because it's not, if you just say allegory or poetry, that doesn't get to the heart of it. What at the heart of it, I think Genesis 1 through 11 is laying out what ancient Israel believed about God, about humanity, and about the purpose of the natural world. And in the ancient world, the way ancient people wrote about their beliefs regarding the gods is they used a certain genre of writing that we now call mythology, whether it's Greek mythology or ancient Near Eastern mythology.
Yeah, because back in the antiquity, history and mythology were intertwined.
Yeah, when they were writing, but I would say when they were writing about their gods weren't necessarily really involved in history. They were in the realm of the gods, and history was just a cyclical thing. Life was just a cyclical thing. And I put this in my book, Heresy of Ham, and I'm sure I have it on my blog. I think the way I understand Genesis 1 through 11 is the writer of Genesis, he's setting out, again, I'm a literature guy, so I like analogies. Genesis 1 through 11 is kind of like setting up the stage upon which the history of Israel is told, but the stage is not the play itself, And so Genesis 1 through 11, and you really see this in the early chapters, it's setting out the basic beliefs about who God is, the nature of mankind, that we're in God's image, but we're sinful and we die, and therefore we need salvation. And therefore, I think Genesis 1 through 11 kind of sets that up. And so I just use the term myth because it's just my way of saying whatever you call how the other ancient writers wrote, Genesis 1 through 11 is written like that.
The Christ mythers we used historicized myth, but the other way around in the case of the biblical text would be mythologized history.
Say that again?
Said the Christ mythers used to cling on to the term historicized myth. Historicized myth.
Okay.
And the other way around in the case of like the Exodus or the Trojan War would be mythologized history.
Right. I would Yeah, I wouldn't call the Exodus myth.
Right.
Yeah.
It was something. There was a minor event, but it was expanded upon and
Yeah,
immortalized in legend.
I would say this is a good way to show how Genesis 1 through 11 works too. In the telling of the Exodus, of the Hebrew slaves leaving the Exodus, leaving Egypt, that story is told against the backdrop of Genesis 1 through 11. And you think about it, there's a lot of connections in the flood story in Genesis 1 through 11. The world is corrupt. God sends a flood, but then through Noah, he starts over again. And then the Exodus, as they're leaving their bondage of Egypt, they're going through the Red Sea. They're passing through the sea, and then they make their way to the new land. It's like, and so if you are a Jew and you're reading the story of the Exodus, you're seeing that the writer of the Exodus is making allusions to the flood story to make a point. God choosing the Hebrew people, he's creating a people for his name. So if he's creating a people for his name, he's going to use language about the flood of recreation, and so there's echoes of Genesis 1 through 11 in the Exodus story to make a theological point about what the significance of that Exodus is.
Right. Biblical History Skeptics says, I view chapters 1 through 11 of Genesis as being a literary work retelling the Babylonian exile and mythological means.
Yeah, well, I think you could definitely see some Babylonian exile stuff in there, and I think that in fact, I tend to think, even though there's no way of knowing, I tend to think Genesis 1 through 11 might have been composed during the Babylonian exile.
Yeah.
Could be. I mean, maybe not, but yeah. So yeah, you can see echoes of that. But I think yeah.
He also said, question for Dr. Anderson. What is your opinion on a Midianite origin for Yahweh based on the Shasu inscription and Moses' revelation while with the Midianites? Seems possible to me.
Well, I mean, I don't know much about that specific inscription. I mean, I can't.
It's about an inscription during the reign of Amenhotep III, if I remember, the father of Akhenaten, which references Bedouins in the Transjordan called the Shasu, and one of them being the Shasu of Yahweh.
I didn't know about that. So since I didn't know about that, I don't know how much I can really comment. But other than it kind of was similar to what we were talking about with the Canaanite stuff. I think their understanding of Yahweh obviously was shaped by their culture. And so I'm surprised if there's some kind of influence in the way they viewed him that way. But yeah, I really don't know.
All right. Let's see. Rhett Quigley says Jesus says to eat his flesh and drink his blood in John 6:54, and 1 Corinthians 10:16, the chalice of benediction which we bless is not the communion of the blood of Christ and the bread. Anyway, he follows up with the Bible irrefutably teaches that the word of Jesus Christ at the Last Supper, this is my body, this is my blood, is literal.
Yeah, I agree. And Orthodox take that, because Catholics are transubstantiation, Protestants are like, no, it's just symbolic, nothing else. And the Orthodox, and I kind of like the Orthodox view. They basically say, well, yeah, he says it's his body and blood, and so okay, we're going to leave it at that. We're not going to try to figure it out. They call it the mystical. They call the Eucharist in the Orthodox Church the mystical supper. So they say, yeah, it really is still wine and bread, but it's mystically his body and blood. And we're not going to tease it out beyond that, because we're just going to stay with the text and we're good. Which again, I kind of like. That doesn't try to do more than it says. So.
And Utopia Buster says Barker is an evil gnome misotheist.
Who?
Barker.
Oh, Dan Barker?
Yeah.
And who is he? Did he say?
He says he's
No, Bob Barker.
says he's an evil gnome misotheist.
Gnome, like garden
Yeah,
gnome?
garden gnome.
Okay. I don't know what that means, but I'm sure it's not a good thing. Yeah. When I debated him, on one hand, he's debated so often, he can do it easily. But yeah, it's reading his books, not impressive.
Biblical history skeptics says, too bad Christian wings rarely get their heads out of fundamentalism.
Christian wings?
I'm guessing it means right wingers.
Oh. Well, one of the things that has bugged me, and I think I mentioned this at the end of my Heresy of Ham book, is how politicized a lot of this stuff has become. Whether, Ken Ham, really everything he says about Genesis and creation, it really goes to, because he's fighting the culture war, because he's, right-wing conservative and has certain right-wing conservative issues. And then anybody who objects to his stance on creation evolution seems to just, then we're going to take the opposite political views. And I don't understand how one's view about creation evolution, or how to read Genesis 1 through 11, how people can so easily immediately tie that into certain modern political views. I don't get that. But that's a whole nother issue, I guess. So.
All right. Let's see what else. Utopia Buster says, "Goodbye Jesus" has become a full-on belly laugh joke.
It doesn't surprise me. I think somebody recommended it. I looked it up on Amazon. I'm like, it's the same kind of blather as the other stuff, but yeah. And it's probably, I would say it's probably more speaking out against some of the stupid elements in fundamentalism, which, okay, but then you conflating that with the entirety of historical Christianity, it's kind of a problem.
Biblical history skeptic says, Dark Ages is such a misnomer. That's why most scholars don't talk about a Dark Age anymore.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Scholars know it's a joke.
I mean, there was a legitimate Dark Age following the collapse of the Roman Empire, but that only lasted like a couple hundred years before everything got revived again.
Yeah, and it had nothing to do with Christianity.
No, it had the collapse of paganism. Well, and actually, if you want to say it, when Constantine moved the capital to Constantinople, I mean, Western Europe became just kind of like the Wild West. I mean, because there was no government, because he took it away, But
it's like, I mean, a lot of people don't really realize is how much the sort of relationship that Constantine and the Christians had, how that actually did shape how we've seen secularism between Christianity now and then, because Constantine wasn't a theologian by any stretch of the imagination. No. And so he generally, if there was a theological problem, he would just say, I'm just going to leave that to the theologians.
Yeah.
And that was actually unheard of back then, because usually it was just the religion and the state was just, the theologian, was the man in charge. It was the king or whoever was in charge. That was your main guy you went to.
Yeah, volume brass.
Oh.
I was going to say, I mean, the whole Roman Empire, the thing was, the main religion was the worship of the emperor. That's what got Christians in trouble. And then with Constantine, and the whole concept of separation of church and state really was something that was begun with the rise of Christianity, because they wanted to keep them separate. St. Augustine's the Tale of Two Cities, the city of God. There's a city of God and there's a city of man. There's a difference. And they wanted the church to be the conscience and, to keep the government to account, but it's not the same. Now, but yeah, the more you learn about the history of that time, and then, the Rodney Stark book is fascinating, The Triumph of Christianity.
And there's also God's Philosophers.
The what?
There's also God's Philosophers. I forgot the author's name.
I have to look at that. But yeah.
James Hannon. I actually have him as a friend on Facebook. Not Facebook. I have him He's a follower I'm on Twitter.
Biblical History Skeptic says, tell Dr. Anderson if he does anything on Christ Smithers, I am more than willing to help out. I have hundreds of sources, including many that Carrier misrepresents if he wants them.
Oh, like a book? Writing a book?
But yeah, or if you do more blog posts or anything like that, or a book.
Maybe down the road, a blog post here and there, but yeah, the little I did, I think I did like 4 or 5 posts last year on Richard Carrier because I bumped into him on Twitter discussing somehow, on the Twitterverse, you talk to people and it was him. And so I asked him some basic questions and he kept on saying, well, why don't you just buy my book? Like, it's 800 pages. It's $80.
That's what every conspiracy theorist tells you. If you don't agree with me, you haven't read my book.
Yeah.
So then whenever
don't worry. Hey, don't worry. I can get it for you for free.
Well, that's the thing. So, somebody got it for me in electronic version. So I read it and then I wrote I think 4 posts based on the book and some videos I watched of him. And it was just like, oh my, yeah, it's just.
When his low IQ, uncultured followers on Twitter just summon him in a Twitter thread, he'll just stroke his own dick the whole time about having a PhD and a peer-reviewed book.
Yeah, well, that's another ironic similarity between him and something like Ken Ham. They're always like, Ken Ham's like, oh, we have peer-reviewed people at Answers in Genesis. Did I tell you they're peer-reviewed? They're peer-reviewed. And that's exactly
well,
it's like,
people have such this fetish with peer review. I mean, barbers get peer reviewed.
Well, literally, like Ken Ham, for example, they're peer reviewed. But basically, what that means is like somebody who works at Answers in Genesis wrote an article, and everybody else at Answers in Genesis read it and reviewed it. That's literally like 8 people. And then Richard Carrier, the same thing. Like, oh, my book was peer-reviewed.
Yeah, but his was dubiously peer-reviewed by a now disbanded 2-man band who were known for publishing crackpot material.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. His was peer-reviewed by like 2 or 3 nuts. Like, okay. And that's the thing. Like, I've written a couple books, but some people have read them and great. I'm not going to, they're peer-reviewed. Who cares? If you read it and like it, great. If it's convincing, it's going to be convincing.
Darth Calculus says, sorry I'm late. Yeah, you're always late.
Is this getting recorded, by the way?
No, we're live.
No, but you don't record it at all?
No, we just go live.
Oh, okay. That's fine. I was going to say if you record it, give me a link, but you didn't, so who cares? It doesn't matter.
Utopia Buster says, John Locke developed the concept of separation of church and state.
Well, I don't think he originated it, but again, in that time period, before him, when Martin Luther broke away from the Catholic Church, he appealed to the secular rulers, and so that's what led to the wars of religions for 100 years or so, where each secular ruler of Europe then said, oh, we're Calvinists, we're Lutheran, and they kind of blended the two again, and then as a reaction to that, during the life, somebody like John Locke, they kind of, hey, we need to keep them separate, which is good, but he didn't originate it in history.
Well, I mean, just remember, man, Islam clearly just needs a reformation because that went so well the first time that Christians had it.
Yeah. It's so funny. I grew up in the Assemblies of God Church, which means I knew nothing about church history at all. We didn't care. And the more I learned about church history, the early church stuff, the Orthodox stuff was really interesting to me. But once I got to the Reformation, and all of a sudden you have thousands of different denominations arguing over everything. I just not impressive. So, but yeah, I mean, that being said, I mean, when Luther did break away from the Catholic Church at the time, there was some real corruption in the Catholic Church that needed.
Yeah, the Reformation at the time was needed, but what followed was uncalled for.
Yeah, and I would say it's because
you got the St. Bartholomew's massacre and all that shit that followed.
Yeah, well, it's because like the concept of sola scriptura sounds great, but
It's heretical.
If you don't have it rooted in the tradition of the church, and if you don't consider how the early church viewed things, anybody could open up a Bible and make up anything. And that's the problem. That's what led to all the denominations. So, but again, I mean, there's some good stuff came from it, but.
And that's what we have young Earth creationism from.
Yeah, I would say the 20th century young Earth creationism is like an extreme example of what sola scriptura gets you. It's this idea that I don't need no education about the Bible. I can just read it myself.
And they inherit that when those fundagelicals lose their faith and become atheists, anti-theists, they retain that same mentality. Like,
exactly.
Oh, I don't need any scholarship. Like, very few of them recently have literally rejected scholarship and philosophy and stuff like that.
Which is very similar to what Ken Ham does. Yeah, I've had both young Earth creationists and new atheists like, oh, you think you're so, what about you, your smart theology, you Mr. Scholar? They're like, okay, so you're clearly don't want to learn, So, yeah, it's true.
All right, one more question before we wrap up.
Okay.
Utopia Buster asks, has Dr. Anderson considered Lydia McGrew's book, Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences?
I have not heard of that book. Is it like a specific creation evolution book, I assume?
I don't know.
Okay. No, I haven't read it. My background is in literature and then obviously my biblical studies stuff. I know the history of biblical studies, but my first love is understanding how the literature works. I've only gotten into the creation evolution debate the last few years. And even that, the parts that interest me is the impact it has on theology. When scientists start talking about all the nuts and bolts of, my eyes glaze over. I'm not a scientist. I know enough. I mean, I'm competent.
Utopia follows up with same argument atheists make who say they've read the Bible. You can't just read the Bible.
Yeah, that's what we're talking about. Yeah. If it's just
and she says, he says, no, she makes connections with obscure historical references in the Bible. That's what the book's about, I guess.
No, what's the name of it again?
Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences.
I remember I actually joked with an atheist I was trolling them really, because they had said this, I read the Bible from front to back when I was 12 years old. And I said, yeah, and the problem is you haven't done that with another book since.
and you were 12.
Yeah.
One more comment. Jack Simino, Dolphin Avatar, says, speaking of fundy atheists, I know an Orthodox Christian who witnessed a new atheist yelling to a girl at the mall that there is no God, Santa Claus, and life after death.
Yeah. I don't. When you get some people who are kind of off their rocker, you get stuff like that, I assume. But yeah, I looked up on Amazon that book that person mentioned. I'll take a look at it, but yeah, I haven't heard of it yet. But.
Anyway, we should be wrapping up. Any closing thoughts? And tell the dear audience where to find you.
Okay. My closing thoughts is, hey, this has been fun. Good conversation. You can find me at my blog, Resurrecting Orthodoxy. It's joeledmundanderson.com. I try to write fairly regularly on there. You could ask questions via that. Obviously, I know I have Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, but I hardly ever use the Twitter. I mean, Twitter I sometimes use, but I don't. The only thing I use Twitter for most of the time is just to post my blogs and occasionally make a comment. But yeah, if you want to, you're always check out my stuff on Amazon. Like I said, I have a couple books. If you want to learn more about the creation evolution debate, my Heresy of Ham book is good. If you want to learn more about kind of the history of Western culture and stuff, my Christianity and the Revolution of Worldview. I should know that title. I have to keep on looking for it. That's good. And that's how you get in contact with me. Pretty much.
I implore you go to Edmund Anderson's blog. It's criminally undersubscribed. Also,
yeah.
Also on
I'm
the
not a good
10th,
salesperson. I need other people to promote me.
well, just do what Carrier does. Promote yourself.
Yeah, I can't do that. I'm like, I want to read it. That's fine. If not, it's okay. I also have a Patreon account, actually. I haven't done anything this summer, but what I try to do, what I'm doing right now, my writing projects right now, I'm trying to write like an Old Testament intro book and a New Testament intro book, but a real intro book that normal people could understand, you know, because a lot of intro books written by academics, they're like this big. There's too much information. And so I'm trying to write 2 books that are more user friendly. And I set up, because I'm just an adjunct at this point, I set up a Patreon account, you know, if you want to donate. And then what I tried to do during the school year is like every week come out with like a little 15-20 minute video about something biblical that I've been working on, you know, kind of. So you can do that. I'm sure you can find me on Patreon. It's just Joel Edmund Anderson. That's small,
All right.
small people there too, but more the better.
Our next interview will be on the 10th. We'll be interviewing Tim O'Neill, so be tuned for that and promote the shit out of that. Also, share, like, and subscribe as you like it. And see you next time.
All right. Thanks.
Si bien on va qu'on l'appelle, s'il convient de refuser, rien n'est fait.